The canvas of the tent was as stiff as sheet metal. When I ran my bare hand along the slash in the fabric, the edges were frayed, pointing outward. They had cut their way out from the inside. It was February 26, 1959, on the eastern shoulder of Kholat Syakhl, a mountain in the northern Urals. The wind sounded like a saw against the exposed rock. Inside the tent, 9 pairs of boots sat in a neat row. Rations of salted pork and hardtack lay untouched. Outside, 9 sets of footprints pressed into the crust of the snow, leading down toward the dark line of the forest. Some prints showed only socks. Some showed bare feet. The temperature was -30 degrees Celsius. In January 1959, the city of Sverdlovsk was a center of Soviet industry, wrapped in the deep freeze of the Ural winter. At the Ural Polytechnical Institute, a sports club organized expeditions to test the endurance of its students. Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student, proposed a route into the northern Urals. His objective was Mount Otorten, a peak standing 1,182 meters above sea level. The journey would cover 314 kilometers on skis. Upon completion, the participants would receive a Grade 3 certification, the highest classification for hikers in the Soviet Union at the time. Dyatlov assembled a team of 10. They were experienced skiers, accustomed to the brutal conditions of the taiga. Among them were Zinaida Kolmogorova, a 22-year-old radio engineering student, and Alexander Kolevatov, a nuclear physics student who had previously worked at a classified research institute in Moscow. The oldest member was Semyon Zolotaryov, a 37-year-old veteran of the Second World War and a professional hiking instructor. They spent weeks preparing their equipment. They sewed their own canvas tent, joining 2 smaller tents together to accommodate the entire group. Dyatlov designed a suspended wood-burning stove out of sheet metal to keep the interior warm without melting the snow beneath the floor. They packed heavy woolen sweaters, felt boots called valenki, and canvas anoraks. They carried axes, a 2-man crosscut saw, and a mandolin for the evenings. Their rations consisted of buckwheat, salted pork, sugar, and hardtack. The total weight of each rucksack exceeded 30 kilograms. The expedition was methodical. They mapped the route along the Lozva and Orspia rivers, planning to establish a supply cache near the base of the mountains before making the final ascent to Otorten. The institute approved the route on the 20th of January. The medical board cleared all 10 members for the physical strain of the journey. They were not novices taking a reckless gamble. They were technicians, engineers, and veterans executing a calculated plan. I reviewed the manifest of their equipment. Every kilogram was accounted for. Every kilometer of the route was plotted. They knew the terrain, and they knew the cold. They understood that in the northern Urals in winter, the margin for error is measured in minutes. They departed Sverdlovsk by train on the 23rd of January, carrying their skis. The train ride from Sverdlovsk to Ivdel took them deep into the Sverdlovsk Oblast, away from the industrial center and into the logging territories. They arrived in Ivdel on the 24th of January. From there, they took a bus to Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement of any significant size in the region. Vizhai was a staging ground for logging operations and penal colonies, a place of wooden barracks and diesel fumes. The hikers spent the night in a local hostel, checking their gear and purchasing a few final loaves of bread. On the 26th of January, they hitched a ride on an open-backed truck heading toward a logging site known as Sector 41. The temperature was -16 degrees Celsius. The hikers sat in the back of the truck, exposed to the wind, singing to pass the time. At Sector 41, they spent the night in a workers' dormitory, sharing stories with the loggers. The next morning, they hired a horse-drawn sled from a local worker named Velikivicius to carry their heavy rucksacks for the next leg of the journey, a trek to an abandoned geological settlement called Nord 2. It was during this march that Yudin began to suffer from severe joint pain. A chronic condition in his knee and back had flared up in the cold. By the time they reached Nord 2 on the evening of the 27th, it was clear that Yudin could not continue. The physical demand of breaking trail through deep snow with a 30-kilogram pack would cripple him. On the morning of January 28, Yudin bid farewell to the group. He gave his share of the communal rations to his companions. He handed his heavy winter coat to Doroshenko. Zolotaryov asked Yudin to take a pair of skis back to the institute. They embraced, took a few final photographs, and Yudin turned back toward Vizhai, riding the empty sled. He was the 10th man. His departure left 9 hikers on the trail. Dyatlov told Yudin that they expected to return to Vizhai and send a telegram to the sports club by the 12th of February, though he noted it might be a few days later. Yudin watched them ski away into the tree line, moving in single file along the frozen Lozva River. The sky was overcast. The wind was picking up. From this point forward, the expedition was entirely isolated. There were no more settlements, no more logging camps, no more outposts. There was only the taiga, the frozen rivers, and the rising elevation of the Ural ridge. The diaries recovered later indicate that the mood was high. They were making good time, covering roughly 15 kilometers a day. They documented the snow depth, the air temperature, and the condition of the ice. They were functioning exactly. For the next 3 days, the 9 hikers followed the course of the Lozva River, then turned west to follow its tributary, the Orspia. The snow in the forest was deep, often reaching their waists. They took turns breaking trail, a grueling task that required the lead skier to plow through the powder while the others followed in the tracks. They maintained a rigorous schedule. They woke before dawn, ate a breakfast of porridge and tea, and skied until the late afternoon. In the evenings, they pitched their large canvas tent in the shelter of the trees, assembled the sheet metal stove, and wrote in their diaries. The entries from these days are mundane and professional. They note the difficulty of the terrain, the minor repairs made to their equipment, and the jokes shared around the fire. On the 30th of January, the temperature dropped to -25 degrees Celsius. The wind shifted, blowing hard from the northwest. They were approaching the tree line. The dense taiga began to thin, replaced by stunted birch and dwarf pines. On the 31st of January, they reached the upper edge of the Orspia River Valley. Before them lay the open slopes of the mountain ridge. They attempted to cross the pass that day, but the wind was too severe. The diaries note that the headwind was strong enough to halt their progress entirely. They retreated back into the tree line to camp. The next morning, the 1st of February, they prepared for the final ascent toward Otorten. They knew the climb would be steep and exposed. To lighten their loads, they built a labaz, a temporary cache in the woods. They dug a pit in the snow, lined it with pine branches, and deposited 55 kilograms of surplus food and heavy equipment. They left behind a mandolin, a pair of backup skis, and enough rations for the return journey. They marked the cache with a pair of crossed skis driven into the snow. Now carrying only what was necessary for the next few days, they began their ascent late in the afternoon. They moved out of the Orspia Valley and onto the eastern slope of a mountain designated on their maps as height 1079. The Mansi name for the mountain is Kholat Syakhl. They climbed higher, leaving the protection of the forest behind. The wind on the exposed slope was relentless. By 5 in the evening, the light was failing. They were roughly 1.5 kilometers from the tree line, and 300 meters below the summit of the ridge. Instead of descending back into the forest where they could find shelter and firewood, Dyatlov made the decision to pitch the tent right there, on the open, windswept slope. They unstrapped their skis and began to dig into the hard-packed snow, excavating a flat terrace to anchor the tent against the incline. The temperature was falling steadily, approaching -30 degrees Celsius. The final hours of the expedition are documented in a series of photographs recovered from their cameras. The negatives show the team working in the fading light of February 1st. They are bundled in heavy coats and hoods, using their skis to shovel snow. They dug a pit roughly 1 meter deep to level the ground and provide a windbreak for the tent. They laid their skis flat on the bottom of the pit to serve as a foundation, insulating the floor from the frozen earth. Over this, they spread their empty backpacks and heavy quilted jackets. The tent was pitched securely, its guy lines anchored to ski poles driven deep into the snowpack. Inside, the 9 hikers arranged themselves shoulder to shoulder. Because they were above the tree line, they had no firewood. The suspended sheet metal stove remained in its canvas bag, unused. They ate a cold dinner of salted pork, hardtack, and Korean loin. They cut the pork into precise, even slices. They assembled a satirical broadsheet, a tradition among Soviet hiking clubs, which they titled The Evening Autumn. The tone of the writing was light-hearted, joking about the cold and the snoring of their companions. This piece of paper, pinned to the canvas wall, is the last written record of the Dyatlov group. They removed their heavy felt Valenki boots and their thick outer jackets, preparing for sleep in their woolen sweaters and ski pants. Some wore thick woolen socks, others wore thin cotton ones. They placed their cameras, diaries, and flashlights in the corners of the tent. Outside, the wind accelerated. Weather data from nearby meteorological stations recorded a severe cold front moving through the region that night. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, accompanied by gale-force winds. The tent on the slope of Kholat Syakhl was completely exposed to the elements. What happened next is not recorded in any diary or captured on any film. The timeline jumps forward. The 12th of February arrived. In Vizhai, the telegraph office received no message from Dyatlov. At the Ural Polytechnical Institute in Sverdlovsk, the sports club administrators were not immediately alarmed. Delays in winter expeditions were common. A broken ski or a heavy storm could easily add 3 or 4 days to a route. But by the 16th of February, the families of the hikers began to demand action. Zinaida Kolmogorova's parents contacted the institute. Yuri Yudin, who had returned safely weeks earlier, expressed his concern. On the 20th of February, the institute officially declared the group missing and organized the first search parties. The institute mobilized students and instructors, dropping them into the taiga by helicopter. The military and local law enforcement joined the operation, bringing in tracker dogs and experienced Mansi hunters who knew the terrain intimately. They established a base camp in the Orspia River Valley, near the route Dyatlov had submitted. They fanned out in grid patterns, probing the deep snow with avalanche rods. On the 26th of February, a search party led by a student named Boris Slobtsov was navigating the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. Through the blowing snow, Slobtsov spotted a dark shape protruding from the white expanse. It was the canvas tent. It had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow, but the ski poles anchoring the corners still held. Slobtsov and his partner approached cautiously. They called out, but there was no answer. They began to clear the snow from the canvas. The tent was heavily damaged. A large section of the roof had been torn open. When investigators later examined the fabric, they determined that the tent had been cut from the inside. 3 long vertical slits had been made with a knife, and the canvas had been torn outward, creating an exit large enough for a person to pass through. Inside the tent, the searchers found a scene of frozen order. The heavy winter coats, the felt Valenki boots, and the woolen blankets were all left behind. The cold rations of pork and hardtack sat untouched on a cloth. The group's money, train tickets, and identification papers were secure in a tin box. The cameras and diaries were in their places. The stove was still in its bag. There was no sign of a struggle inside the tent. No blood, no torn gear, no indication of an animal attack. The 9 hikers had simply cut their way out of their shelter and fled into the night, leaving behind the equipment that was absolutely essential for their survival. Outside the tent, the searchers found footprints pressed into the hard snow crust. The tracks led away from the tent, heading down the slope toward the northeast, in the direction of the Lozva River Valley and the tree line. The searchers counted 8 or 9 distinct sets of tracks. The footprints were orderly. They did not show signs of panic or running. The stride lengths indicated a walking pace. But the details of the prints were alarming. Some showed the impression of thick woolen socks. Some showed a single boot. Others showed the distinct shape of bare toes pressed into the ice. The tracks descended the slope for roughly 500 meters before disappearing under the shifting drifts of snow. The temperature on the night they fled was at least -25 degrees Celsius. To walk away from the tent without boots or heavy coats in those conditions was a death sentence. The investigators documented the position of every item inside the tent. A flashlight was found resting on top of the snow covering the canvas, its switch in the on position, though the battery was dead. A second flashlight was found inside. The meticulous arrangement of the boots and rations contrasted sharply with the violence of the slashed canvas. The search party radioed their findings back to the base camp. The realization set in among the rescue teams. The next day, the 27th of February, the searchers reached the tree line at the bottom of the slope. Here, the terrain flattened out, and the snow was deep and powdery. At the edge of the forest stood a large, ancient Siberian cedar tree. Beneath its branches, the searchers found the remains of a small fire. The snow had melted away to reveal charred wood and ash. Beside the fire lay the bodies of two men, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonyshenko. They were dressed only in their underwear and thin cotton shirts. They had no footwear. Their hands and feet were burned, and their skin was scraped and bruised. Above them, the branches of the cedar tree were broken up to a height of 5 meters. Blood and skin fragments were found embedded in the bark, indicating that one or both of them had frantically climbed the tree, either to scout the terrain or to escape something on the ground. The searchers then turned their attention back to the slope, following the line between the cedar tree and the abandoned tent. 300 meters up the slope from the tree, they found the body of Igor Dyatlov. He was lying on his back, his head pointing toward the tent. He wore a light sweater and ski pants, but no boots. One hand clutched the branch of a small birch tree. 330 meters further up the slope, they found Zinaida Kolmogorova. She was buried under 10 centimeters of snow, lying on her side, also facing the tent. Her face was bruised, and blood had frozen around her nose and mouth. 180 meters beyond her, closer to the tent, they found Rustam Slobodin. He was lying face down, wearing a single felt boot on his right foot. Autopsies were conducted in the town of Ivdel. The medical examiner concluded that all 5 had died of hypothermia. Slobodin had a minor fracture in his skull, but it was not deemed the fatal cause. The bruises and abrasions on their bodies were consistent with falling on the rocks and ice in the dark. The search for the remaining 4 members continued through March and April. The winter storms refused to break, burying the valley in meters of fresh snow. The search teams probed the area around the cedar tree with long steel rods, striking nothing but frozen earth and rock. The military brought in metal detectors, hoping to find the missing hikers' equipment. The families waited in Sverdlovsk, enduring weeks of silence. The official investigation, led by Lev Ivanov, stalled. The evidence gathered so far pointed to a desperate struggle against the cold, but it offered no explanation for why 9 experienced men. It was not until May, when the spring thaw began to melt the snowpack, that the final discovery was made. 75 meters deeper into the forest from the cedar tree, the terrain dropped sharply into a steep ravine carved by a small stream. On the 4th of May, a Mansi tracker noticed pieces of torn clothing near the edge of the ravine. The searchers began to dig. Under 4 meters of dense, wet snow, they found a makeshift den lined with pine branches. A few meters away, in the bed of the stream, they found the bodies of the last 4 hikers, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, and Semyon Zolotaryov. They were better dressed than the others. Zolotaryov wore Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. Dubinina's foot was wrapped in a piece of Krivonyshenko's wool pants. They had stripped the dead at the cedar tree to survive. But the autopsies of these 4 revealed a completely different reality. While the first 5 had died of exposure, 3 of the 4 in the ravine had suffered catastrophic blunt force trauma. Thibault-Brignoles had a severely fractured skull. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had multiple broken ribs and massive internal bleeding. The medical examiner stated that the force required to cause such injuries was equivalent to a high-speed car crash. Yet, there was no external soft tissue damage. The skin was not broken. The bruising was minimal. It was as if they had been crushed by an immense, localized pressure. Furthermore, Dubinina was missing her tongue and eyes, though this was later attributed to the natural flow of the stream where she lay. The investigation introduced a final variable when radiological tests were ordered. Trace amounts of beta radiation were found on patches of the clothing recovered from the ravine. The levels were low, but their presence was documented in the official file. On the 28th of May, 1959, the Soviet authorities abruptly closed the case. The final report concluded that the hikers died due to a compelling natural force that they were unable to overcome. The files were classified and sent to a secret archive. I have read the autopsy reports and the meteorological data. I have studied the photographs of the slashed canvas and the footprints in the snow. The evidence does not fully support any single explanation. An avalanche does not leave neat footprints walking away. A military strike does not leave a tent standing with rations laid out for dinner. The physical record is a collection of contradictory facts that refuse to align into a coherent sequence. We know how they died, but we do not know why they fled. If these stories of vanished crews and silent ships speak to you, subscribe to